Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Midweek program at the J.C. Raulston Arboretum. My name is Blake, and today we are in the White Garden because this particular garden in the J.C. Raulston Arboretum was influenced by the White Garden at Sissinghurst Garden in the UK. And, wouldn't you know it, the world is a big and beautiful place full of beautiful gardens that are all kinds of influential. So today on our program, we are going to be talking about our top 5 or 10 or 12, or maybe they just keep going on, but the most influential gardens that we've been to. So we've got our director, Mark Weathington, here, as well as a special guest, Bryce Lane, who is a former interim director, but he is presently a staff member. He's an official honorary staff member, whatever that may mean. Yeah, but we've got a great program for you today where we're going to talk about beautiful gardens in the world and the impact that they can have on people. So it should be all kinds of wonderful. Those of you watching this on YouTube, please like this video and subscribe to our channel, and feel free to leave a comment down below. And with the announcements out of the way, I will pass things over to Mark and Bryce to tell us all about their most influential gardens.
Hey Bryce.
Mark, how's it going?
It's going all right. This was a tough one. We let you in behind the scenes. We sit around every once in a while. We get together, Blake and Evan and Greg and Sophia and Tim and myself, and we talk about the next several months, and we throw out ideas. And I was like, well, how about Bryce and I get together and talk about gardens that have influenced us the most. That'll be easy. So, how was this easy task for you?
Well, Mark, it's interesting to note that before you can talk about, at least I thought before I could talk about the 5 gardens that influenced me the most, I'd have to probably put a list together of all the gardens that I've visited. And so that was the rabbit hole I went down, and I spent 3-4 hours putting, I took a globe and I started to go around saying, I've been here and I've been here. And so, after I got done, I was so proud of having come up with how many total gardens I've been to. Of course, then it's like, well, what's a garden?
Right.
And then, of course, I got my list. And then from there I went and, Blake first said, 5 most influential. I said, that'd be easy.
Yep.
And then it was like, okay, now I have this list, and I don't necessarily want to compare how many gardens I've visited versus how many you've visited, but I have this list. And then I start looking, it's like, well, what do you mean by influential?
Right.
Like, influenced my career, influenced my plantsmanship, influenced my life, influenced me as a teacher. What about the gardens I visited when I was 25 years old and I haven't been back to?
Mm-hmm.
And what about the gardens where I've been 25 plus times? So yeah, this was not an easy chore.
Yeah.
And this morning I got up and looked at my list and said, I need to change them, but I didn't.
Yeah, I did not go through and try and figure out all the gardens I've been to. That would have been a monumental task. Where do you put Spring Grove Cemetery? Is that a garden? That's a tough one. And yeah, I threw out the obvious ones. Really, if you want to talk about influential on me as a person, as a leader, as a gardener, as a plantsman, there's Atlanta Botanic Garden where I worked out of college. There's Norfolk Botanic Garden where I worked for a decade. And there's the J.C. Raulston Arboretum that I've worked at for 2 decades now. And even before I got here was influential for me.
Right.
It would have been okay. It would have been an all right one to put in because it really did influence me before I got here. But put all those.
So we're in agreement. We can take the Raulston Arboretum and just kind of put it over the side because it's in a category all by itself.
That's right. It is.
As far as influence, unique. Absolutely. For myself as well. Well, that's good.
Yes.
Mark and I we consulted, but we did not divulge.
Yes.
So this is not rehearsed as far as, okay, you do these gardens, I'll do those gardens.
I don't think we'll have any overlap. There's only one possible garden that you could have overlap, and I'm going to be interested to know to see what you think of that garden, or if you've been there. It may be one that you haven't been to.
It's possible that I haven't.
It's a newer one on my list.
Okay.
All right. Want me to start?
Please, you go first.
Okay. One of my favorite gardens in the world is the Dunedin Botanic Garden in Dunedin, New Zealand. I was giving a talk down there, and I spent several weeks in New Zealand traveling from the top of the North Island down all the way to the South Island to Dunedin and got to spend a few days there. In between talks, I could go out and really see Dunedin Botanic Garden. And it influenced me a few ways. Some ways I can manage, in some ways I can't. And I looked at this as influenced me as a gardener, is really how I mostly looked at this list. And they have topography. They have hillside gardens. And I was looking at these hillside gardens and just the way they could layer plants. You know, we talk about layering plants, and we usually, you know, sometimes you talk about the garden floor and the walls and the ceiling and, you know, having these different things. But the way they could layer plants and you could view them, you know, in layers really was, you know, big for me. Now, we built the berms here. I'm looking at this maybe on a little bit lesser scale. And part of that hillside garden was their rock garden. And I had always been kind of rock gardens, yeah, they're okay. Maybe partially because I live in the South and they're a little bit more difficult than if you live in Massachusetts. But their rock garden was so eclectic and so just amazing. The plant material, the stonework, all of it really kind of blew me away. Now, have you been?
No, I have not been.
Okay.
I've been to New Zealand, but not to that botanical
The Dunedin Botanic Garden, really. I'm glad I went there. I don't know if it would have been on my list if I hadn't been given a talk there, but it was amazing. And I'll tell you what, it didn't just inspire me. It inspired kind of passion all over the place. And what you can't see is two people rolling around in the rhododendrons there. But the other thing that really has stuck with me is when you have gardens, and they were kind of wild and exuberant, if you have these clean edges, it really pulls everything together.
Right.
You know, and so they would have these walks, especially through their rhododendron garden, where it's just these great displays, whether it's all green because it's not in season or they're in flower, but these really straight walkway through there with a nice focal point at the end. And that really struck me because, let's face it, there were some weeds in there, and there was some stuff that, you know, I would be like, but when you put that edge on there, I was like, nobody's going to notice this because it all looks so together.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's interesting too. The idea that visiting botanical gardens, visiting gardens, private gardens, etc., has multi-layer benefit. And as a teacher, I think for me, it's like, all right, what as a gardener, but also always thinking from what can I learn? Right. What can I take away from? And I've tried to teach people, okay, this is an approach that you need to take when you visit a botanical garden or you visit a garden is, okay, let me find 3 things that I can learn from my experience here and then apply it, whether it be to us as gardeners, I'm going to do this in my own garden, or from a conceptual perspective, for instance, if I'm teaching. So that's really fascinating. I mean, I've been to a number of gardens, and let me ask you a question about Dunedin. Very British flavor, or was it unique unto itself?
It was pretty unique unto itself. You know, it had New Zealand plants. A lot of those New Zealand botanic gardens are very focused on their native ecology. As an island country, it makes sense. So this, from the sense that it was very metropolitan in its plants, was reflected more the British garden. But it was pretty much a thing unto itself, I would say.
Yeah. That was just interesting because some of the botanical gardens I've been to, like Christchurch Botanical Garden, and some of those surrounding gardens, it had an English flavor to it.
Very much.
But yet, embedded in that garden were native New Zealand plants, you know, that kind of thing. And so the idea that the rhododendron has made it all over the world is quite fascinating, both native and otherwise.
Yeah. It's it really is. Now, you said you tell people about, you know, kind of botanic gardens, you know, things you go look for these things. Here's my take on botanic gardens, a way that you don't think about using them, and you wouldn't need to at this point now. You've been happily married for a long time. But a first date.
Oh, it's a great place.
First date. You're not sitting at a dinner across from the person. You're not at a movie where you can't talk to the person, but you're side by side. So it's low pressure.
That's a really good point.
And you walk around and, you know, it's public, so it's safe. which is a consideration now. I have a daughter. I know, you know, and you can, if it's working out, you can sit on a bench. You can, you know, you can stay longer. If it doesn't work out, you go your separate ways. If it works out, you know, how romantic were you that you took your date to a botanic garden the first time around?
It's a suggestion that I will give to my teenage grandsons.
Yeah.
It's like, if you're looking for a place to go, you know.
I got that from my son. My son told me that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. All right. You know, so I've got stateside and then global. And these are not in necessarily any order of this is the first, second, third, except I did number them when I sent Blake some photos because he needed to know which one I was going to talk about first. So I am stuck to the order. Although Blake's good enough to be able to troubleshoot. So, one other thing I thought about with this is, how cliche do I go with gardens? That a lot of people might go, oh yeah, I've heard of that one. And then how personal do I get to the point where I'm not worried that Mark Weathington is here going, why did he pick that garden? Because it's how it influenced me, not necessarily. Right. So first one I'd like to talk about from that standpoint is Coastal Maine Botanic Garden in Boothbay Harbor, Maine, for a number of reasons. One, I'm soon to be married 49 years tomorrow. And my wife and I honeymooned in Boothbay Harbor, Maine in 1977 when the Coastal Maine Botanic Garden wasn't even a germ of an idea in anyone's head, much less the community members in that greater area. In fact, it wasn't until 91 that it was an idea, and it wasn't until 2007 when it opened. Yeah. But there's a garden that's for me, there's a garden that communicated a lot for me as a gardener, gardening in the South. Now, that sounds so weird, okay? Why would a Maine garden be something that a Southern gardener would find educational? Well, let's talk about the normal things. Plant combinations, and I'm not plugging the class that's coming up, but they're masters at doing that. I've watched that garden grow from being a relatively small garden to being quite a large garden. I think it's 148 acres now. I use my cheat sheet on that. One of the things, topography, I got to echo topography. They're right in a place that goes down to water, but it's a multi-tiered journey to get from the top area down to the water, and it goes from formal gardens into wooded, so there's that transition as well. So first or second time, actually, I think we were probably featuring the show, the In the Garden with Bryce Lane show, at Coastal Maine, because Rodney Eason, an NC State grad who had worked at Longwood, was now head horticulturist there at the time. And we wanted to feature NC State connections, not just plants, but also people. And so we went up and interviewed him. And at the time, one of our undergraduate students was interning there. Kristen Neal was interning there. So it was a great opportunity to feature. So there I am. There's this beautiful mixed border of Russian sage, echinacea, lots of different echinacea.
There's some liatris there.
Liatris, that was it too.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So you looked at the photo.
Yes.
And I'm getting ready to do a feature on, mixed borders and all the different plants together. And a lady from Virginia and her husband were walking behind me. I found out they were from Virginia afterwards. And she looked at her husband. She said, "Harold," she said, why does this perennial border look so much better than ours? We live in Southern Virginia, and yet this looks more dynamic. It was the 1st of August, Coastal Maine, right? And my ear perked up, and I turned. It was a teachable moment. I said, "Ma'am, where are you from?" She said, "Oh, we're from the coastal area in Virginia." And she said, "Summertime, my perennial border just looks so tired, and the flowers start to fade, and there's just not." And she said, "And here it's just gorgeous," right? And so it occurred to me that, the average high in the middle of the summer in Maine is 77 degrees, and the average low is 58 to 60 degrees. They have an hour and a half more daylight during the summer months than we do, latitude speaking. So here we have this environmental situation where plants can sequester, and accumulate, synthesize so much more sugar. To what effect? More flowers. Not only that, but, our blues and red pigments, anthocyanin pigments, are temperature related as far as production, and so they're their degradation is slowed by cooler temperatures, especially when you have warm days and cool nights. And so I don't know whether the woman, she was looking at me like, what just hit me? Because I went into instructor mode, and I'm like,
did.
right. And she said, well, is there anything we can do in Virginia? And I said, you can move. And I said, but if you do move, understand that, springtime, early spring in Maine is not early spring in Eastern Virginia. And she said, Harold, we're staying. But it's interesting that I'd never really thought about it until I actually was there studying that garden and looking at the different plant selections and whatnot, where you see, Rudbeckia maxima chest high in August, right? Where in Raleigh, in my own garden, it's 7 feet tall. I've got it all secured so it doesn't flop, because in the spring it's kind of like the basketball players whose joints haven't developed well enough because they grew so fast.
Yeah.
Springtime in North Carolina is like this, where you have a lot of cell division and elongation in plants, so you end up with plants that are way taller and subject to flopping than you would in Maine, where a Maine spring is incrementally warmer, and you don't have those. So you've got plants that never get anywhere near as tall. But anyway, that garden is a place, and to finish it out, far as influence, I have 6 grandchildren, all of which have been to Boothbay Harbor, Maine on their 10-year-old trip, and all have had to endure touring the coastal Maine Botanic Garden. My grandkids are not necessarily interested in gardening or horticulture as a career, but they love the outdoors, and I'm sure part of that has come from the fact that their grandfather's a gardener, and if they travel with him, guess what? We're going to stop. So
And Boothbay gets a little bit of cold mitigation from that, the water, and so they can grow some things that you don't necessarily expect in Maine. What I think of them that you didn't even mention were their hardscapes. They're used to stone, and they're it's just really masterfully done.
They've also created a garden that is very user friendly if you need assistance, and have seen to it that works out well. Very, very, very friendly people. But
you think that some of that is because they are so young that when they started, there was already, we think about this a lot more than we did 50 years ago or 100 years ago, like some gardens.
No, if you think 1991, accessibility was already on the forefront of thinking about that. And so I suspect so. I mean, they've got a whole kiosk area where you can pick up like you do at the grocery store, a cart with, a little electric cart you could ride around in, and there's not one path that I visited through that whole garden that was not accessible to any golf cart or a smaller cart.
But
so that's a good point.
You don't feel like you're on a freeway when you're walking through there.
No. And my favorite garden there is the garden of the 5 senses. So they've created this garden that is the whole mission and theme of that garden is to put plants in that appeal to the 5 different senses and do it in a way that is absolutely beautiful site-wise, but also an area that is, from a fragrance perspective, touch and feel. That's the area where they have their ability garden for the elderly program that they have that's nearby there, because it appeals to the senses as well. And I've never seen so many dragonflies in the lake/pond fountain area in the middle of that garden. So it's one of those very unique things. They've got a maze that's nothing but rounded rocks that have been put together with mortar in between, and you can't walk it unless you take your shoes and socks off. So there's that sense of walking on rounded rocks.
That'd be fun.
Yeah, it's very cool. So I always love going back because they're also a garden, because they're young, it's been very successful, and they're continuing to grow. Yeah. One of the best children's gardens I think I've seen.
Shoot, their parking lot.
Oh gosh, I know. The woodies that are in the parking lot alone. Yeah.
Okay, I did not do this intentionally, but I kind of went from furthest away to closest. So I'm gonna go to another one that's a little farther out there, and that is in Japan. It's called Sanzen-in Temple. I have to admit, I appreciate a traditional Japanese garden. I appreciate it. It's not my thing. I'm a plant guy, and they use such a limited palette of plants. They're beautiful, a good one's beautifully done.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you can see, mountains to the sea, or however the type of garden. They're really spectacular. Sands Inn Temple was a little bit different in that it was like a plantsman's garden. But it was a temple, an old temple. It had, this long history of the gardens around it. But it was a woodland type garden around this temple. It wasn't open and grassy, and, it had some clipped things. It has these formality, these along with kind of that woodland, a little bit wild, a little bit hairy kind of growth, but amazing plants there. And it had traditional features. It had, the water, and it had stone lanterns and things like that. And just kind of this magical place. And in fact, we were visiting with a J.C. Raulston Arboretum tour was to Japan. And there was one of the people in the tour got a little bit sick, and I stayed behind that day. And this was a garden that was about 45 minutes away from where we were staying. And the next day we had kind of a free afternoon. We had the bulk of the day was free for people to kind of explore on their own a little bit. And my wife, who is not a plant person, not a garden person, but was there, had gone with the rest of the group to that temple. And she said, "We got to go back. This is going to be a garden you like." And like, it's a long way away. It's a long afternoon. And she said, no, you got to go. And I'm so thankful for her, because it was the highlight for me. And I really love the use of formality of clipped plants that lend this little bit of formality. I'm finding as I get older and I have less control over the rest of my life, that I start thinking that, I want clipped hedges. I don't want clipped hedges. I'm not going to clip hedges. But, doing a few plants that have really strong structure and form in with the rest of my garden is really appealing to me. And this garden, though it was a temple, had some whimsy to it. There's like moss hillsides with little like heads of statues, little cherub heads almost, that would be stuck in there, or little kind of waterways that led to nowhere that kind of surprised you. It was the neatest garden.
And depending on the time of year, you might even get some special whimsy, because I found a temple out near Takamatsu, and it was getting towards December. They had a statue of a lamb. Somebody knit a little scarf for that statue of a lamb and wrapped it around the little lamb statue. The little heads in the ground you've got. I guarantee you somebody makes hats for those to put them on there.
You're probably right. And we think of Japanese gardens as so serious, and some of them are very serious and historic, but then these other ones, it's when you say a Japanese garden, usually what we're talking about is an American interpretation of a Japanese garden. Right. But really, it's what type of garden, because there are different types of garden. What period of garden? They're very, very different in terms of what they look like. And it was a surprise and delight for me to find one that really incorporated that whimsy and that kind of more wild, natural look to it, but was in a temple. It was a real pleasure.
That's awesome.
Wow. All right. I'm going to go across the pond here, my next one. Probably, and where we're headed is southeast of London, in County of Kent. Of course, now everybody who's watching or listening right now is going, oh, he's going to talk about Sissinghurst. He's going to talk about Great Dixter. Nope. I'm going to talk about a little 7-acre that started out as a little 7-acre home garden near Sevenoaks. And back in 1957, the year of my birth, a young man and his wife moved from Scotland down to Sevenoaks and bought a 7-acre piece of property with a beautiful old stone home that dated back to the 1500s. And it used to be a part farm, then someone tried to garden. His name was Roderick Cameron, and his wife moved into this piece of property. And in 1957, they began to garden that property with the intent of making it just a home garden. no intent of it becoming a public garden that people would come from all over the world to see, that kind of thing. And he and his wife double-handedly created this incredible small 7-acre space, sound familiar, in the course of 25 or 30 years. The first time I ever visited was over 40 years ago. Wow. When I first came to NC State, I got asked by a travel company to be the host for a flower and garden tour through Europe. Okay, and it was a company out of Overland Park, Kansas, and Southland Travel, and their whole bit was, let's get a university professor from a southern university to be the host. They'll have a tour guide, a bus of 50 people, take them through Europe, but have the theme of the itinerary focus on visiting different gardens. Mm-hmm. Well, that was the first time I met Mr. Cameron and got a tour of his garden. And so at that time, I'm 26 years old, high impact. But here's as a gardener, this one really influenced me, okay? The idea that turf was used solely as a ground cover for pathways, and that your plant beds would be huge beds, mixed border, that would use the concept of biological weed control as a way to manage weeds, that paths would be curvilinear and oftentimes go to nowhere. One time I was on a path coming around a curve because I wanted to see what was at the other side of the curve, only to hit the chain link fence that marked the edge of their property. And I broke out laughing. I mean, it was hilarious. And so anytime that I was in England and was near there, I would make a point to go and visit. Talk about whimsy. Here's a man who was looking for 25 years, looking through his garden for evidence of Roman ruins as a relic, because I'm told that in England, if you can find Roman ruins in your garden, then that elevates the level of prestige and interest in the garden. And he and his wife looked for 26 years, and the Roman ruins that he was showing us, he finally introduced as these were Roman ruins circa 1977, because we couldn't find any, so we built our own. And so here you walk down a path to, this obelisk and a half-broken wall, and it's Roman ruins that he and his wife built in 1977.
That's right.
But the last time I visited him, and this is talk about influence, we actually featured his garden in a show. And so we went there, and he was 86 years old, and we were sitting just like this. And I was interviewing him, and I said, well, what's a typical day for the gardener of, by the way, I didn't even mention the name, the Great Comp Garden.
Great Comp
C-O-M-P, Great Comp Garden. And I said, what's a typical day? And he said, well, I get up at 4:30, heavy Scottish accent that I'm not even going to try to mimic. He said, I get up at 4:30 in the morning, I eat my porridge, then I put on my jacket and my boots, and I go out and work on my latest gardening project. I'm like, you're 86 years old and you're working on your latest gardening project, which happened to be a retaining wall near the Italian garden. And he said, I'll work out there till 10. He said, then I take my tea in the little kiosk near the car park where people come after 10 o'clock. They pay their 10 to 12 pounds, and in they go through the garden. It has a little tea house where they like a little cafe where they serve customers. He said, and then at 4 o'clock, I close down I take my lunch out in the kiosk. And he said, and then at 4 o'clock, I close it down, put on my gardening clothes, I go back out, and I work till dark. He said, then I go in and I take my supper, I go to bed, and I wake up the next morning, and back out I go. And I thought, we all know that gardening is good for us on all different kinds of levels. But to actually see a man 86 years old still out working on his latest gardening project, a garden that is so friendly. He's showing me this one perennial border, and I'm standing next to him, and we go to walk, and he says, excuse me, watch out. And I look down, and there's a gravestone in the lawn right by the perennial border. His wife had passed, and he buried her in the backyard.
Oh, wow.
And he said, please don't step on that. And I was like, sorry. But, just the whole way that gardens are so intertwined in our lives, even as a gardener. Mm-hmm. I use my garden to mark historical events in my family. Oh, I remember when Megan got married, and remember this, or when a storm came through and knocked a tree down. And so here was this man talking about all these experiences that led to a garden that is now endowed. It's a public garden. You can come and visit. And it turned into a public garden as a result of that. And I thought, when I'm 86 years old, I want that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want people to pay me money to see my garden.
There it is.
No, I want to still have a project that I'm working on in some garden area. Maybe it's in my house, maybe it's not. He lasted there till 90 and then lived for 6 months in an assisted living before he passed. But great comp garden, and I learned an awful lot from that man in his garden.
I've heard about it. I've never visited. Gonna have to put it on my.
I think you would be, knowing you and knowing that you're more than just a plantsman when it comes to plants, the idea of gardening, but it's a plant-rich garden. It's it's filled with some beautiful woody plants. Blake, I don't know if you're showing the photographs, but you can see just combinations of conifers with herbaceous perennials, different themed areas, wooded areas. He's got an Italian garden. It's for a small garden. There's a whole lot packed in there, and I think you'd find it interesting.
I'm sure. Well, I followed you. I'm in the UK as well.
Okay.
This is actually a kind of a still semi-private garden, but he does open it up on occasions, and you can kind of visit there and at least peek in kind of anytime, because he has a nursery. This Ashwood Nursery. This is John Massey's, his garden. It's the single finest home garden I've ever been to.
Really? Now that's saying a lot.
It is form, color, texture, everything you talk about is in that garden, and it is perfect. It is absolutely perfect. And people come from all around to visit him. He was known for hellebores first, and then now he's doing hepatica, the liverworts. He's one of those that goes very far into them. But those are all in his little glass house he has there. The nursery is next door, and much like Roderick, at lunchtime, lunch comes over to his house from the cafeteria there. But when I was visiting, when I got there, he was on the phone with somebody from Japan. We visited him, and as we were leaving, a young woman I'd actually been to the nursery she was from when I was in New Zealand, but a young woman from New Zealand was rolling in to see him. I don't know how he has time to garden, but he does the gardening pretty much all himself. But he just, when I use pictures of him, say, hey, here's a picture of my garden, I pull from my photos of his. But one of the things that just struck me was his kind of, it's not really woodland, but his edges of his garden are wooded because he does a lot of woody plants. But the color he got under there with foliage, of course they grow heucheras that are like shrubs, but then combined with white bark birches, and you really got this sense of depth and layers in there, which was amazing. And then lots of this, the color was all foliage. It was gold leaf maples, and it was blue conifers and all that. But then he also had these little, he didn't have a long border, but he had these little areas that were these pops of intense color that he would have from perennials. We have tried to get him to come and speak multiple times at our Southeastern Plant Symposium in the spring. In the early summer. And he always says, no, that's a bad time for me to leave the garden. I don't know if there's a good time for him to leave the garden, but certainly every time we've invited him, it's a bad time for him to leave the garden. I don't think the garden will be okay without me then. Which is unfortunate, because he is a born teacher. You walk through the garden with him and you just learn so much from him. And it's just kind of this natural conversation, and I don't think he knows how much he's imparting when he does that. And he does open up the garden for open garden days multiple times through the year. So you do get it. You know, if you go to England and time it right, you can visit it.
You can visit it. Wow. You know, since we're talking about personal gardening and how it influences, I'm gonna name a garden right now that I thought it might be on your list.
Yeah.
Because it comes from where you went to college, Blacksburg, Virginia. But many years ago, I was invited up to Blacksburg to speak at the Hahn Horticultural.
Sure.
Right, and after that little symposium, a local Blacksburg resident hosted us for cocktails and a little hors d'oeuvres afterwards in her garden.
In her garden.
And her name is Alyssa Steves. And I first met Alyssa when she spoke in Greensboro at a Guilford County
symposium.
big symposium.
Yeah.
And we kind of just clicked. But little did I know that this reception was going to be in her garden. And of course, she's got, a typical small residential property, but she bought the house. This is going to sound familiar. She bought the house next door. That's become a guest house, and it's given her and expanded the garden. So Alyssa's got a garden that is, oh gosh, Mark, you can talk about it too. I don't know, let's see. First of all, the use of color in her garden is just incredible. And when I say color, I'm not just talking about the color of the plant leaves, the color of foliage, the color of flowers. I'm talking about the color of the hardscape, the color of the furniture, the color of the garden ornament in the garden. It's the first time I think I've ever been through a garden where she took the concept of garden rooms, the English concept of garden rooms, and actually applied it to a southeastern garden where she made the rooms smaller. She incorporated, she'd say, okay, this is going to be the orange area, and between the plants, the furniture, the pots in the containers, all coordinated in that such that you felt right at home when you walked in. It's like, oh, this makes perfect sense. Unique and different in the way that she used woodies to create those little garden rooms. Up to that point, I had never thought of the idea of using plants in containers as incorporated into a landscape bed. Right. I always had containers on my patio, front steps, very American, right? And here I go into Alyssa's garden, and she's got containers that are color coordinated with the plant colors, the flowers, and the furniture, and they're incorporated into the plant beds. And that really changed the way I think about how I want an area in my garden to be. It's like, I don't have a problem now with saying, I'm going to put containers there, and that's going to help flush out that design for that area. But quite the plants woman. She's worth going in spite of the garden. I mean, she's quite the personality, a retired teacher. I mean, she's just a sweet, sweet person. And so full circle, I've been 2 or 3 times, full circle. Oh, well, group from Virginia Tech is coming down. Robert McDuffie brought a group from, and Alyssa Steves is going to be in the tour, and they're coming to tour my garden. I freaked out. I'm like, I can't show her this garden. And she came, and that woman raved up and down. It was like, okay. So there was kind of a kindred spirit there.
Yeah.
But influential, just the attitude that she has about gardening, the way that she put her garden together, some of the things that I took away from there really made a big difference for me.
Bryce, the way that she uses Ruby Falls Redbud in her landscape is exactly the way you use Ruby Falls Redbud in your landscape. And I will include a picture of your garden in the recording so people can see exactly what I mean.
I stole a lot of ideas, but that's what we do. That's what we should do.
Absolutely.
I shouldn't say I stole. She gave me, gladly gave me. And
absolutely.
I love her garden.
Yes.
And you make it sound, you talk about the garden rooms, you talk about the color coordination. She's an artist.
Yes.
And she does that. But then there's so much whimsy in the garden as well. There, through the art, through sound objects, through plantings. It's, there was, her mother-in-law lived in that house next door for a while. Her mother-in-law didn't like the color red. And so when she had a rose dye there, and she spray painted right outside the house.
She's a great speaker too. I mean, I love.
We've had her down here.
Yep. And my favorite, talk about whimsy, was she has this it looks like a shoe rack. I guess it is a shoe rack, and she's got shoes lined up. I almost put that photo in. Like, she's got shoes lined up where she's drilled the holes in the bottom of the shoes and put media in, and then put plants in the shoes, right? And she says, oh yeah, when people come and visit, she said, I'll ask them, are you going to take all your shoes home with you? And it's like, what? She said, well, if you have an old pair of shoes you want to give me, I'll take them. And I said, no, I'm good. I only brought a couple pairs of shoes. I'm not willing to give them away. But I thought, how cool was that? But there behind this rack were skeleton bones, a vertebra. I mean, and you couldn't tell whether the bones were human, what kind of animal, what. And I thought, great, she's inviting me to come and stay at the house next door. She wants my shoes and, maybe she's going to take my bones in the end of it all. But anyway, it was that kind of stuff. Just, any garden that makes me giggle is a garden worth going back to.
I agree. Yeah. I love her garden. Talking about personal gardens, I almost included one that I used to include in my talks as kind of a laugh point. You have some of those slides you put in there, laugh point. And this was a garden where there's a juniper growing up around the light post that was cut into tiers. It was a variegated one. It was green and had green and gold. There was orange mulch with white painted stones around it, and there were orange pumpkins. I guess it was Halloween when I took orange pumpkins hanging from this thing around the lamppost. And then the window, there's mini blinds, but one of the slats is orange, like it's been replaced, and it's the wrong color. And I used to talk about color echoes and kind of joke, the pumpkins match the mulch, match the and they even bring it into the house, which is what you want to. And I went by there one time after I'd moved away. She lived right around the corner from me. Was always out in her garden. I don't know what she did because it was less than a postage stamp garden. She didn't have that many plants in it. But I came back to visit, just to visit Norfolk. I went back up there, and I happened to drive by that house, and everything was gone. It was just all turf, and there was obviously she had passed away or gone into a retirement home. And I looked at it and I was like, well, that is a shame. There was a garden that somebody loved. She loved it. And who the heck am I to make fun of her garden? Surrounding her garden was the same garden over and over and over again, all down the street. Right. And then she had something unique there, and I was making fun of it. And I realized I'd gone by my own garden, and I was like, oh well, it is what it is. But I drove by her garden, and it crushed me. And so I like gardens that are personal. Yeah. That are personal. And I do have another private garden because
come on,
they are. And this one is open regularly for open garden days in England. This is another one in England. It's hard. They've got, I know it's a cliche, but they've got some good gardens there. And this is Matthew Pottage's garden. Now, it's at his parents' house, but at his garden in Battersea. And it happened I was visiting another great plantsman, John Grimshaw, and he said, there's some open garden days. We're going to go visit a garden. And he took me down there. So Matthew Pottage, young man, he was the youngest curator at Wisley. Shortly after I went there, he became the youngest curator at Wisley. He's now over the Royal Parks in England. And this garden, this small garden, suburban garden, was spectacular. And, he couldn't get there all the time. He lived in London, so it was a trek to get out there. So it was amazing how good the garden looked. Much like you talked about, the paths were turf with these crisp edges and filled with plants. There's no weeds growing there. The plants were so lush, although those British weeds are polite. They're quite proper British weeds. That's why they go out with their scuffle hoe and politely get rid of them. But the color that he got without flowers, the textures that he got just always blew me away. There's just this exuberance without the flowers, which I really like because flowers are so fleeting. You mentioned the shortened season in coastal Maine. That's what I tell people. You can have a beautiful garden in Minnesota easily because you've got a month and a half of growing season and everything flowers at the same time. It's hard in the South. It's hard when you have a long season because You kind of have to go, everything's happening at one time, or it's spaced out so long. So you got to have foliage. It's got to be a big one. He's one of the first places where I really got what color echoes mean. He is, I'm talking like in the past tense, like he's gone. He is just a master with that, those color echoes, using color, using contrasting colors, using, pots and things to add color. If you want to see several pictures of his garden, go get my book, because I've used him liberally in my Gardening in the South book. Oops. Just to illustrate points. What I loved the most, though, he had this kind of small turf back garden right off the deck, where you could entertain, that kind of thing. His path went out from that. And he had right at the bottom step, he had cut out in the turf, a perfect rectangle, just perfect, edges perfect. He had an urn in there with a variegated agave and some echeveria, some little succulents, little, planted all around that. And he said, yeah, I just, every year I do something different with that. Last year I had a perfect circle in the center of my lawn, which itself is a perfect circle, and some things. He's like, the whole rest of the garden can get wild and hairy and overgrown. And with this little bit of formality in here, everything else looks purposeful. It's so formal that the whole rest of this exuberant wild garden, it even if it gets overgrown, it looks, and I did take that from there. I was like, that is brilliant. And he said, have you read the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? Mm-hmm. Well, you have your towel. If you have your towel, then you must have all your toiletries and everything else. So when you visit somebody, you have your towel. Well, it's not your fault you don't have your toothpaste. Let me let you know. It's because you're put together. He said it's like that. He's like, as long as I have that little bit of formality, I have my towel. Everything else is good.
Wow. What do you think? What is it about the private garden that it's interesting that you and I have actually kind of migrated for a bit to those? What do you think? What is
for me?
that?
I think it's the personality. You get that personality in there, and it is hard to get that with a big public garden. I think Chanticleer does a pretty good job of that.
They do,
but they do it because their gardeners are so talented and are given such leeway in their individual areas that you go into a garden area and it feels like it's got that personality. And then you go into a different one, it has a different personality, but it's got that personality.
And then the interaction with the individual gardeners there relative to their area, you can see the pride. It's like, this is my garden, and now I'm sharing it. So, no, I would agree. It's just interesting because, both of us talked about private gardens, and then the people that hosted, the people who are behind those gardens, there's that, gardening is about relationship, and it's not just relationship with plants, but it's with people.
You're right. You're absolutely right.
But now my next one takes this, I'm flipping the script here. Okay. So I come home for Thanksgiving from college, and it's cold. I'm in Western Massachusetts. It's cold. I got a Friday with nothing to do. I tell my mom I've heard of this garden in Cambridge, Massachusetts that I want to go visit because my professor at the University of Connecticut raved about the woody plants that were there. I was taking woody plant ID with Phil Carpenter, who was the professor who taught at the University of Connecticut. And I thought, I got to go. So I said to my mom, and my mom, a gardener, and also worked at a garden center, the same one that I cut my horticultural teeth on. So she was interested in plants, but it's November in Massachusetts. And I said, I'm going to this place and you want to come with me? And she said, what is there to see?
Right.
Where are we going? I said, well, we're going to a cemetery. She said, what? I said, we're going to this garden, Arboretum, called Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I had never been, she had never been, but we went. And when we were done that day, my mom, for the first time in her whole gardening career, embraced ornamental bark. So, the Mount Auburn Cemetery, 1831, Massachusetts Horticultural Society, that's amazing in and of itself to think there was Massachusetts Horticultural Society in the mid 1800s. People in Boston are dying because that's what people do, and they've run out of space to bury them in the city. And so they got this idea, let's go buy a piece of farmland out in the boonies and let's create a pastoral garden setting. Now, for everybody who's listening, you're all going, well, yeah, that's a cemetery. What are you talking about? In 1830s, there were no cemeteries like that.
Right.
Okay. And so they bought, hundreds of acres out in the boonies and created this Arboretum / cemetery that became what is now Mount Auburn Cemetery, which has one of the most incredible collections of woody plants, trees and shrubs that I think I've ever seen. And then within the context of this beautiful cemetery setting, it actually marks, and if you research it, it marks the beginning of the rural cemetery movement in the United States. Mount Auburn gets credited with starting that trend.
Ooh.
And anytime I'm back in my home state, I'll make a point to go there. They have, I don't know how many miles, I don't know that I wrote down how many miles of garden paths and roads, but every path, every road has a sign with a plant name on it. So walking down, Daphne Path, all the paths and roads are labeled after plants, which is just brilliant. It's one of the most beautiful places to go, and it's in Cambridge. Okay, so we're no longer in the boonies. If you think
Right.
about 1830s, that was out in the middle of nowhere, and now, right, you got to fight traffic to get to Mount Auburn.
Yeah.
You can drive through and pull over to different areas. You can walk through. It's 700 acres. Yeah, the Massachusetts Hort Society, a guy by the name of Jacob Bigelow, put the whole thing together. And come full circle, I end up speaking at the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Garden last fall. And I got a free day. And so they said, oh, well, we'll take you over to the Spring Grove Cemetery, right? Same story, but just 20 years later, they followed the same pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I put a photo in there. Cercidophyllum japonicum, amazing grace, the most beautiful specimen I've ever seen right along the side of the road that goes through there. Just an incredible collection. So the combination of, remembrance and a garden, it's just kind of followed me around. European cemeteries in the Alps and Switzerland and Italy that look like botanical gardens that are just minded by the relatives who take care of the plots.
Yeah.
The Oxford Memorial Garden in Oxford that remembers the British who lost their lives in World War I. It's a beautiful garden right there on Oxford's campus. So there's this. I've always thought I'm going to write a book and visit all the garden cemeteries in the United States. It's a great idea. I've even got a list together, but I've never gotten off my duff to actually do it. But
They have some of the better ones have some of the best plant collections. They have old trees because they plant them and they don't cut them down and they care for them. And just here in town, historic Oakwood is a great place. And Mount Auburn, when Charles Sprague Sargent was at the Arnold Arboretum, he was bringing in these plants, these woody plants, trees from all over the world, and he was distributing them, kind of like the Arboretum does now. He was distributing them, and Mount Auburn was some of the recipients. So some of those trees are the oldest that are in the country anywhere. Really, some of the oldest in the West, Europe as well. So it's those cemeteries are amazing.
Yeah. So that was my non-garden garden.
Garden.
Yeah.
All right. This is I'm coming to the States, and this is actually one that was pretty easy for me. This is a new garden on my list. This is something that has inspired me pretty recently. This is Stoneleigh Gardens. Have you been?
No, I've not, but I know
Ethan.
I know Ethan when Ethan was at Moore Farms.
Yeah.
I got to know him down there, and he's frequently when I do touch base with him, he's like, "You got to come to Stoneleigh." So And he spoke last year at the Southeastern,
Yeah,
didn't he?
yeah. He so Stoneleigh is an interesting place. It's a big manor castle, kind of up in the Delaware Valley, Chanticleer area. This is an estate. It's an estate with all that implies, and it was left to a conservancy organization. They had nothing to do with gardens. They did native plant conservation. Triangle, like the Triangle Conservancy or any other land conservancy, they did natural areas. And they actually got in touch with me, and I don't know how, and asked if I knew anybody who they didn't know anything about dealing with a garden. And it was when Ethan had just left Moore Farms. And I said, I know a guy who's great with native plants and great with gardens and would be a perfect fit, and was from the Philadelphia area. And so I won't say I'm the reason he got the job.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm the reason. But I didn't visit there for years and years.
Yeah.
And I went there. And so because they're part of this conservancy, they are gardening in this estate with all native plants. Now, the owners was also doing native plants. That's why they gave the land to the conservancy. But it's a historic house as well. But the gardens are being done with native plants. And native plants in the broadest sense. Cultivars, if it's twisted, if it's variegated, if it's weeping, they want it. And they're using this stuff in such amazing ways. They've got naturalistic areas, but this is what blew me away. They have formal areas. They have formality, and they're using native plants. So often, when you go to a native plant garden, it is a garden that's supposed to look like nature. Sure. It is woodlands. It is, and if you want people to use native plants, it's a terrible way, because people don't want nature. They want controlled nature. And I was just absolutely flabbergasted by it. It's funny. I had talked with them there at the beginning, and I was going up to the Delaware Valley, and I got in touch with some of my friends up there, and it's like, where should I go? There's 50 gardens and 50 miles, you say, but I've only been to a handful of them. Right. Where should I go? And somebody I respect very much said, oh, you got to go to Stoneleigh. I was like, oh yeah, that place. It absolutely blew me away. And their hardscapes were amazing, and they were doing more. They were not stopping. They're putting in new things. You mentioned Moore Farms, that innovation in how they do their landscapes. That followed Ethan up there, and so they're doing these really interesting things. I can't get over. I can't say enough about what a great job they're doing in elevating native plants traditional garden plants.
That's a good.
You got to visit.
That's a good educational tool. No, it's on my list. It's next time up there. I really plan to go. Okay, is it me?
It's you.
We're going to go back over to Europe. We're going to go to Germany, and we're going to head down into southern Germany, south of Munich, on Lake Constance.
Okay.
Lake Constance is a lake that gathers much of the German Alps snowmelt. Beautiful, beautiful lake. And sitting in the middle, quote unquote, and an island in the middle of the lake is the island of Mainau.
Okay.
And Mainau, let's see, I want to get the date right. In the early 1800s, a duke by the name of Frederick I Baden took over ownership of this island, which has a large, and I'm going to use the word castle, but not in your typical German castle. I mean, it's a large, you could liken it to perhaps a small chateau in France. Okay. But you want to talk about topography, it's an island that actually starts high and then slowly moves down to not a very big place at all. Let's see, 110 acres. That's the whole island, 110 acres.
Wow.
Okay, and so Mainau started as a quote unquote pleasure garden. We've heard that before. Woody plant collections. In its early years, I'd say early 1900s, it was a place that wasn't visited very much, and is where the collections got larger and more expansive. And it wasn't until the late 1900s, early 2000s that it became a public garden of interest to the point where they created gardens to meet the interests of the general public. If you go in May, you'll see one of the most incredible bulb displays. Think of bulb displays with topography.
Oh, wow.
So you've got, thousands of daffodils and tulips in these unique combinations, like a Keukenhof, okay, like in the Netherlands, but on hills that come down to the water. Blake, I put a photograph in there of this water element that starts at the top of the hill, talk about topography, and moves all the way down, and then on either side it's woody ornamentals framed by perennials. And it's an incredible place where, go to one other area of the island, it's all about how to garden with perennials. And they've got perennial borders that have combinations of plants with interpretation, telling you what the plants are. It's a place that I've taken photographs for the Woody Plant ID class that I used to teach years ago. Of the most gorgeous weeping Sephora japonica I've ever seen. And what's so unique is there's the weeping Sephora japonica and there's the straight species in the background.
Oh, wow.
So to be able to frame that. It's a garden full of whimsy. They have a whole area called My Now Kinderland, which is kiddie land, right?
Yeah.
And it's nothing but photopiary of animals, that wire framed animals filled with media, then planted with annuals. More adults in Kinderland than kids.
Right.
But it's a place. In 2011, we took a group of NC State students on an international field trip starting in Zurich, and we visited that garden. I could spend 3 days there and still not see everything. The idea of the way they use containers and in a retaining wall, where they built the retaining wall with little areas where media could go, and they'd put plants in those containers. Just a unique and interesting place that big on the tourist, but sometimes forgotten as a horticultural.
Yeah,
Have you ever been?
I've never heard of it.
Island of Mainau and Lake Constance.
Island of Mainau.
Shame on you.
You got me intrigued.
No,
The European gardens are. I'm very.
yes.
Those I haven't. Those aren't a lot of those on my list.
Yeah.
That I've been.
Yeah,
that I've been to. Not that are influential, but that I've been to.
There are 1,700 different kinds of trees on that island.
Wow.
And you can get there by boat. You can park in the car park and walk on a peninsula, on a peninsula that takes you out there. It's and the last thing I'll say about it is, one of the most influential things is I went to get a bratwurst and a beer, right? And you go to this outdoor cafe and they have tables, people sitting on both sides of the table. You've got table, and then you have a trough that's a plant. It's a pot, but it runs the whole length of the table with annuals and plants growing. You've got pear trees, fruited pear trees, in containers running up through. So the actual outdoor eating area is surrounded by all these plants. And, I'm a tourist. I get my bratwurst, I sit down, and if it had just been picnic tables, I'm not sure I would have been as comfortable sitting with strangers. But here I am sitting amongst plants that run along the table, and a pear tree with fruited pears there. It was summertime. And the next thing you know, we're talking about, well, where are you from? And so it was kind of a place that brought people together, and was still like, you still felt like you were in a garden, not in a cafeteria at a garden.
Wow.
But I can't say enough about that place. I'd go back there in a heartbeat.
Wow. Yeah. That's amazing. Now, mention some that we didn't get on the list, ones where we grew up.
Honorable mentions.
Probably what's influenced me the most, my home garden. I did not do a bunch of honorable mentions, but two I'll tell you that influenced me here in kind of more of the leadership capacity is Chanticleer, which I mentioned, and the Morton Arboretum. And I talk about this a lot, in that Morton Arboretum is the champion of trees. That's what they call themselves. And if you go there, you know it. In their oak collection, they've got a bench that spells out strong. And, everything they do is centered around trees. It is not about plants. It's about trees. They're the champion of trees. And they do research around the world. They do amazing, incredible, important work. And then Chanticleer, which is a pleasure garden. That's what they say. We're a pleasure garden. And they know who they are. And I always when I talk to, whether it's extension agents who want to start up a garden at their, in their counties, or it's a new botanical garden starting, or it's one that's established that's, perhaps floundering, is if you don't know who you are and why you are, you're not gonna be successful. Even if you're successful, you're not gonna be successful because you're not doing what you're there to do. So knowing who you are is important, and that they know exactly who they are. Couldn't be more different, but they know, and so they are incredibly successful.
I've walked away from Chanticleer years ago, watched it grow from being a garden that wasn't even open to the public, and now, knowing that it's okay to fill areas of my garden with large leaf plants that make you think about being in the tropics, just by the way they've put together gardens around the buildings that have that very tropical flavor. Yeah. And they're fine with those plants not all making it through the year. I mean, I agree. I got to shout out JC because, influential gardens. I don't know that I'd be here sitting here talking to you about the influential gardens, and I got a bunch of other honorable mentions that I won't mention but one. But JC was the most influential garden mentor for me. Anytime I traveled, I would go to his office and say, as a young faculty member, I go to his office and say, JC, I'm going to the West Coast. Give me a list. And he'd pull out a piece of paper and he'd say, oh, go here. Oh, make sure you go here, but then ask for this. Go here. He said, oh yeah, and if you're gonna visit nurseries, this was way back in the late 80s. He said, go to Isley Nursery. I didn't know anything about Isley Nursery. I show up at Isley Nursery, I walk in and they said, hi, how can we help you? I said, well, I was wondering if I could get a tour of the nursery. He said, well, who are you? And I said, well, my name's Bryce Lane. I'm at NC State University. I'm a faculty member there. And they said, oh no, we're really busy. We can't do that. I said, oh, that's really too bad because J.C. Raulston told me that this would be the first nursery I should come and visit out here in this area. And they said, J.C. Raulston, come on in. Next thing you know, I'm in a cart driving through the whole nursery. Okay. But that very same trip, actually it was a few years later, I was on sabbatic and I had a West Coast trip lined up. Went and saw JC, wrote a bunch of gardens down. And then he paused and he said, if you don't have time to go to these gardens and you only have time to see one more place and you're up in the San Francisco area, he said, I want you to go to this place. And I said, what place is it? A garden? He goes, no. He said, it's the ancient bristlecone pine forest in the White Mountains of California, which run right along the border between California and Nevada. And if you stand in the White Mountains and you look across Owens Valley, you're looking at Yosemite and the Sierra Nevadas. And I said, why would I go there? And he said, because there is a monoculture of trees, natural stand of trees, that are the oldest living trees on Earth. And so I did what he was told. I went, what he told me. I went, and it changed the way I understand plants. I mean, if you think about it, you're 10, 11,000 feet in altitude, 4 inches of rainfall a year, mostly in the form of snow. You've got trees that range in age from 2 years old to 7,000 years old. And it's in a almost 100% dolomitic limestone with virtually no pest pressure or competition with other plants. It's a very unique and interesting place where the trees themselves look like they're half dead. Yeah. But they're actually half alive. Right? And in 1957, a dendrochronologist by the name of Edmund Schulman, he was at the University of Arizona, and dendrochronologists verify climatic events in the course of human history by looking at growth rings on trees. And he heard a rumor that up in the White Mountains, there were trees that were thousands of years old. And so he went up there. And the first tree that he took an increment bore and bored in to count the rings, the first one he did was a standing deadwood. Pulled out, needed a microscope to count the 7,500 growth rings. Wow. I think, and I've said this publicly in a number of classes, I think Edmund Schulman peed his pants right there. Right? So he starts going through this grove of thousands of trees, coring the live ones now, only to find one that was about 4,500 years old. Named it Methuselah. Yeah. And you go there and you're looking at trees that are half of the tree. They're not very large, and they look ugly at first look because half of it's dead. But biologists believe that the secret to their longevity is that they allow parts of themselves to die so the whole can live. There's limited resource, and so the tree is figuring out a way to do it. Human geriatric scientists visit this forest to try to figure out why. If you go to areas in that grove where water collects, like ditches where water collects, the trees are taller and they don't live anywhere near as long as if you're on the south-facing slope where you barely get any rain and so it's like, what is the secret to longevity and JC never told me why I should go. He said, you just should go. It will change your perspective on plants. Ooh. And so, yeah, that would be my honorable mention that I almost put first.
Wow.
And a shout out to JC too, because that's the kind of, influence he had on me.
All right, well, now you got to go through your list. Just through the names of your honorable mentions.
Oh, honorable mentions. Palace Castle in Wales.
Yes.
There's this 1200 AD castle that's built on a big hill. Obviously, you build your castle on a hill. That's where I learned all about tiered gardens. You mentioned tiered gardens. Just an incredible place with yews that have been pruned for hundreds of years and they look like animals.
Yeah.
That was one. Bristlecone pine.
Bodnut in Wales.
Bodnut was another one of mine. Yep, absolutely. Stourhead.
Oh, yeah.
South of Bath. 1500s, this Henry Hoare, classic English garden, big lake in the middle, then a path that goes around. You walk the path, you see. That's where I learned about vistas, sight lines on a large scale. I've been once, and I want to go back because it was Missouri Bach Garden.
Yeah.
I think that's just like kind of the quintessential, if you want to go to a botanical garden, and if you have scientific interest, they'll meet your needs. If you have ornamental interest, they'll meet your needs. Plants, gardens.
Yeah.
And then a big shout out to the Missouri, the Botanical Gardens plant finder.
The plant finder, yeah.
It's Blake
great.
and I are hooked on the, I advertise that more than the NC State, plant toolbox, which I should promote. So look at the toolbox too, but that was on there too. And then last but not least would be Chatsworth, which is a National Trust property, central North England. And it was there that I met a gardener who had worked there for 70 years in the same garden. And I was 25 years old looking to advance through my career. And he talked about the fact that he had worked in this garden for 70 years, started when he was 16 years old, he was 86.
Wow.
And it changed my whole perspective on, the idea of what upward mobility means within the context of a career.
Yeah.
And I'm still here at NC State. But yeah, so that was kind of a cool one too, just because of the history of the great conservatories in the 1800s. So yeah, you asked me that, I had those.
Okay.
Left a bunch dangling. But how many gardens? If you could estimate, how many gardens?
Gosh, I can't even begin to, a couple hundred. I don't know. Well, how about you?
Well, all that I could remember and write down, excluding maybe some private gardens that I don't remember and haven't written down, 150, 160.
Yeah. Yours has got to, I must be overestimating because I think you've been to a lot more gardens than me. The European gardens, I'm really shallow.
I was thinking Asia is my weak suit. Asian gardens, except for, of course, Australia and New Zealand down under, but,
And China is doing some amazing gardens now.
And that's where I'm got a big giant global hole.
Yeah, awesome. That was a lot of fun.
It was.
It was a lot of fun. It seemed like people tuning in had a lot of fun. We didn't actually have any questions, but there were a lot of comments being like, "Oh, I've been there. That was beautiful. I love that so much. It really inspired me too." So I think we really struck a chord, even if we didn't get any questions asked on this program.
I love it. Love it.
Beautiful.
That's good.
So thank you so much, Mark and Bryce, for going through and sharing your most influential gardens from us. I love, we got to see a lot of really gardens, but there was really beautiful gardens, see a lot of really beautiful gardens, but then there was like the horticultural wisdom that you guys gleaned from those throughout all of that. Like there was a lot to learn about gardening and just life generally from this presentation. So I really appreciate both of you taking the time to go through and think about that so thoroughly to give us good answers for it, because this seems really valuable.
Yeah, it was good that I thought it was going to be easy. If I'd known how hard it was going to be, I may have said, let's go talk on hydrangeas.
Honestly. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in on the Midweek program today. We will be back next week. We will be broadcasting the Plant Lovers Tour that Greg just did yesterday about trees that make great shade. So that should be all kinds of fun. We will see you all next time. Y'all take care.